There's a fundamental misunderstanding most people carry into conflict, and it's this quiet belief that if they just explain themselves clearly enough, calmly enough, logically enough, the other person will eventually understand. That belief works in healthy conversations. It completely fails in toxic ones, because toxic people are not arguing to understand you. They are arguing to engage you. And that distinction changes everything. When a smart person encounters toxicity, they don't immediately focus on the words being said. They focus on the intention behind them. They recognize patterns: deflection, blame, shifting, exaggeration, emotional provocation. These aren't random behaviors, they are strategies. And once you see them as strategies, you stop treating the conversation like a mutual exchange of ideas and start seeing it for what it really is: an attempt to pull you into emotional chaos. Toxic individuals thrive on reaction, not resolution, not clarity, not truth, reaction. Your frustration, your raised voice, your need to defend yourself, that's the reward. The argument itself is not the goal. You are. Think about how many times an argument escalates not because of what was said, but because of how someone reacted. A toxic person will often say something just provocative enough to hook you. Once you're hooked, once you're emotionally invested, they've already won. Because now the conversation is no longer happening on your terms. It's happening on theirs. Smart people understand this at a deeper level. They understand that attention is a form of currency. Every time you argue, every time you try to prove your point to someone who is committed to misunderstanding you, you are spending that currency. And the return on that investment is almost always zero. In fact, it's often negative. Because not only do you walk away mentally drained, but the toxic person walks away reinforced. They got what they wanted: your time, your energy, your focus. And perhaps most importantly, your emotional reaction. That reaction validates their behavior. It tells them, this works. This gets a response. And so they repeat it. There's also a deeper psychological layer at play here. Toxic individuals often operate from insecurity, but it doesn't show up as vulnerability. It shows up as control. By pulling you into an argument, they shift the dynamic. Now it's not about their behavior anymore. It's about your reaction. The spotlight moves away from them and onto you. You start explaining yourself, defending yourself, justifying your tone, your words, your intentions. And in doing so, you've unknowingly accepted the role they assigned you. Smart people refuse that role. They understand that not every accusation deserves a defense, not every statement deserves a response, and not every conversation deserves participation. This isn't avoidance, it's discernment. It's the ability to recognize when engagement is productive and when it's simply performative. Because arguing with a toxic person is like stepping onto a stage where the script has already been written. No matter what you say, the outcome doesn't change. The goalposts move, the narrative shifts, logic gets twisted. And suddenly, you're not even arguing about the original issue anymore. You're arguing about the argument. And that's the trap. The more you try to win, the deeper you get pulled in. The more you explain, the more material they have to manipulate. The more you react, the more control you give away. Smart people see this early. They don't wait until they're exhausted to realize it. They recognize the signs at the beginning. The subtle baiting, the emotional undertones, the lack of genuine curiosity. And instead of engaging, they step back. Not out of weakness, but out of awareness. Because real strength is not in proving your point to someone who refuses to hear it. Real strength is in maintaining your composure when someone is trying to disrupt it. It's in choosing clarity over chaos, discipline over impulse. There's a quiet confidence in that kind of restraint. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to win the argument. It simply refuses to play the game. And that refusal is powerful. It disrupts the pattern. It denies the toxic person the reaction they were expecting. It creates a kind of silence that they don't know how to handle. Because their entire approach depends on engagement. Without it, their strategy collapses. Now, This doesn't mean you never speak up. It doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect or avoid difficult conversations. It means you become selective. You engage where there is mutual respect, where there is a possibility of understanding, where the conversation is grounded in good faith. But when those elements are absent, you don't force them into existence. You walk away. And that's the part most people struggle with. Walking away feels like losing. It feels like giving up, like leaving something unresolved. But smart people reframe that entirely. They understand that resolution requires two willing participants. And when one person is committed to distortion, there is nothing to resolve. So they don't chase closure in places where it doesn't exist. They protect their energy. They protect their focus. And most importantly, they protect their peace. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't, did I win the argument? The question is, did I keep control of myself? And that's a different kind of victory, a quieter one, but a far more meaningful one. So the next time you feel pulled into an argument that feels more like a performance than a conversation, pause for a moment. Ask yourself what the other person is really seeking. Is it understanding or is it reaction? Because once you see the difference, you gain a choice. And that choice is where your power lies. Not in what you say, not in how loudly you say it, but in whether you say anything at all. Sometimes the smartest move you can make is not to win the argument, but to refuse to become part of it. If you start looking closely at how your days unfold, you'll notice something most people overlook. Your energy is constantly being spent, often without your permission. Every conversation, every reaction, every internal debate, it all draws from a limited reserve. And yet, most people treat their energy as if it's infinite, especially when it comes to dealing with difficult or toxic individuals. Smart people don't make that mistake. They understand that energy is not just about physical effort. It's mental clarity. It's emotional stability. It's the ability to think clearly, to make sound decisions, to remain composed under pressure. And once you begin to see energy in that way, something shifts. You become far more selective about where it goes. Because not every situation deserves access to that part of you. Toxic interactions, in particular, have a unique way of draining energy at an accelerated rate. It's not just the conversation itself, it's the aftermath, the replaying of words in your mind, the frustration of not being understood, the lingering tension that follows you long after the interaction has ended. One argument can occupy your thoughts for hours, sometimes days. And for what? That's the question smart people ask early, not after the damage is done. They don't wait until they're exhausted to evaluate whether something was worth it. They assess it in real time. They ask themselves, quietly but honestly, what am I gaining from this? And more importantly, what is this costing me? Because every argument has a cost. Even if you win, even if you prove your point, even if the other person eventually backs down, there's still an exchange happening. You've invested time. You've invested focus. You've allowed your emotional state to be influenced by someone else's behavior. And smart people are very cautious about who they allow that kind of influence. There's a kind of discipline in walking away from something that feels unjust, something that feels like it should be addressed. It goes against instinct. Most people feel the urge to correct, to clarify, to defend. It feels almost like a responsibility, to set the record straight, to not let something inaccurate or unfair go unchallenged. But smart people recognize that not every incorrect statement needs correction, and not every unfair situation needs confrontation. Because the moment you decide that everything deserves your response, you lose control over where your energy goes. And that's a dangerous place to be. Toxic people, whether consciously or not, rely on this lack of selectivity. They push, they provoke, they test boundaries, not necessarily to reach a conclusion, but to see how much access they have to your time and attention. And if you respond every time, if you engage at every invitation, you train them to expect it, you become predictable. And predictability in this context is vulnerability. Smart people break that pattern. They are not available for every conversation. They are not responsive to every provocation. They create a kind of boundary that isn't always spoken, but is consistently demonstrated. It's the boundary of discernment, the ability to say, without words, this is not worth my energy. And that boundary is not built overnight. It requires self-awareness. It requires honesty. It requires you to confront an uncomfortable truth sometimes. The reason we engage is not because the situation demands it, but because our ego does. We want to be right. We want to be understood. We want the other person to acknowledge our perspective. And when that doesn't happen, it creates tension inside us that we feel compelled to resolve. But smart people learn to sit with that tension instead of reacting to it. They understand that the need to be understood by everyone is unrealistic. That some people will choose not to see you clearly, no matter how well you explain yourself. And instead of exhausting themselves trying to change that, they redirect their energy toward environments and relationships where understanding is mutual. This is where a deeper level of maturity comes in, the ability to prioritize peace over validation. Because often, those two things are in conflict. If you chase validation from toxic individuals, you will sacrifice your peace. You will find yourself constantly explaining, constantly defending, constantly trying to bridge a gap that the other person has no intention of closing. But if you choose peace, you accept that not everyone will understand you, and you become okay with that. That acceptance is freeing. It allows you to disengage without guilt. It allows you to walk away without feeling like you've lost something, because you realize you're not walking away from a meaningful exchange. You're walking away from unnecessary depletion, and that's a very different perspective. Smart people also recognize that attention amplifies behavior. What you respond to, you reinforce. If you consistently engage with negativity, you give it more space in your life. You give it more opportunities to grow, to repeat, to become a pattern. But when you withdraw your energy, when you stop feeding those interactions, something interesting happens. The dynamic begins to change. Either the behavior diminishes because it's no longer effective, or the distance between you and that person increases. In both cases, your energy is preserved, and that preservation is not selfish, it's essential. Because the same energy you waste on unproductive arguments could be invested in something meaningful. In your work, in your growth, in relationships that actually add value to your life. Smart people are always thinking in terms of allocation. Where is my time best spent? Where does my attention create something positive? And toxic arguments rarely meet that standard. So they opt out, not loudly, not dramatically, but deliberately. They don't feel the need to announce their boundaries or justify their absence from conflict. They simply become less available for it. And over time, that quiet consistency builds a reputation. People begin to understand that you are not easily drawn into chaos, that you operate on a different level of awareness. And that in itself becomes a form of respect. So when you find yourself at the edge of another unnecessary argument, pause. Not to think of a better response, but to question the need to respond at all. Ask yourself whether this moment deserves your energy, or whether your energy deserves something better. Because in the end, your life is shaped not just by what you do, but by what you choose not to engage in. And the smartest decision you can make is to stop investing in battles that were never worth the cost to begin with. There comes a point, if you're paying close enough attention, where you begin to realize that the most powerful response you have is not what you say, but whether you choose to say anything at all. And for most people, that realization feels counterintuitive. We're conditioned to believe that strength is expressed through words, through arguments, through the ability to defend and assert ourselves in real time. But smart people come to understand something deeper. Silence, when used with intention, is not the absence of power. It is the refinement of it. Because silence is not passive. It's a decision. It's the moment you recognize what's happening in front of you, and instead of reacting on impulse, you choose control. You choose restraint. You choose not to participate in a dynamic that doesn't deserve your engagement. And that choice, although it looks simple from the outside, requires a level of awareness that most people haven't developed. Think about how quickly people respond when they feel challenged. A comment is made, a tone is used, a line is crossed, and immediately there's a reaction. Words come out before thought has fully formed. Emotion leads, and logic follows behind, trying to catch up. In those moments, silence feels unnatural, almost uncomfortable. That discomfort is important, because it reveals just how conditioned we are to equate response with strength. Smart people resist that conditioning. They create a space between stimulus and response. And in that space, they regain control. They assess. They observe. They ask themselves whether engaging will elevate the situation or simply prolong it. And when the answer is clear, they act accordingly. Not impulsively, but deliberately. Sometimes that action is speaking. But often, especially in the presence of toxic behavior, that action is silence. Now, silence is often misunderstood. It's seen as avoidance, as weakness, as an inability to stand up for oneself. But that interpretation usually comes from people who rely on reaction to maintain control. When they don't get the response they expect, it unsettles them. It disrupts their rhythm. It forces them to confront something they're not prepared for. Someone who is no longer playing the same game, because silence removes the feedback loop that toxic people depend on. When you argue, you provide input, they respond. You respond again. The cycle continues. But when you choose silence, you break that cycle. There's no material to work with, no emotional reaction to amplify, no engagement to sustain the interaction. The conversation loses momentum, and with it, the control they were trying to establish. And that's where silence becomes powerful. Not because it says something, but because it refuses to say anything in a space where nothing meaningful can be said. There's also a psychological clarity that comes with silence. When you're not speaking, you're observing. You notice patterns more clearly. You see inconsistencies. You recognize intentions that might have been missed if you were too focused on formulating your next response. Silence sharpens your perception. It allows you to understand the situation, rather than just react to it. And that understanding gives you an advantage. Not in the sense of winning, but in the sense of not being pulled into something beneath your standards. Smart people are not interested in winning arguments with toxic individuals. They're interested in maintaining their own level of composure, their own clarity, their own internal order. Silence protects that. It creates a boundary that doesn't need to be explained. It communicates, without words, that you are not available for this kind of interaction. And over time, that message becomes clear. People learn what they can and cannot get from you. They learn that you are not easily provoked, not easily drawn into unnecessary conflict. And that changes how they approach you. But perhaps the most important aspect of silence is what it does internally. When you choose not to react, you interrupt a habit. You disrupt the automatic cycle of stimulus and response. And in doing so, you strengthen something that is far more valuable than any argument you could win: your self-control. Self-control is quiet. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to prove itself in every moment. It simply holds steady, even when there is pressure to move. And the more you practice that, the more natural it becomes. Silence stops feeling like something you're forcing, and starts feeling like something you own. Now, this doesn't mean you become silent in every situation. It doesn't mean you suppress your voice or avoid necessary conversations. There are moments that require clarity, that require directness, that require you to speak with conviction. But those moments are different. They are grounded in mutual respect, in the possibility of understanding. Toxic interactions rarely offer that. And smart people know the difference. They don't waste silence where words are needed, and they don't waste words where silence is more effective. That distinction is what gives them control. It's what allows them to navigate difficult situations without becoming part of the dysfunction. There's also a certain level of confidence required to remain silent when others expect a reaction. It means you're not dependent on external validation. You don't need to be seen as right in every moment. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding. You're comfortable letting things be, even when they're not resolved in the way you might prefer. That kind of confidence is rare, and it's powerful because it shifts your focus from controlling the situation to controlling yourself. And once you have that, the situation loses its grip on you. The words being said don't carry the same weight. The provocations don't land the same way. You become less reactive, more grounded, more intentional. And that changes everything. So when you're faced with toxicity, when you feel that pull to respond, to defend, to engage, pause. Not to find better words, but to question whether words are needed at all. Consider what silence might accomplish that speaking cannot. Because sometimes, the most effective statement you can make is the one you never say. Sometimes, the strongest position you can take is the one that doesn't require you to step forward at all. And sometimes, the greatest power you demonstrate is in your refusal to participate. In a world that constantly pressures you to react, to speak, to prove, there is something profoundly disruptive about a person who remains composed, who chooses silence, who walks away without explanation. Be that person. Because in the end, silence is not about withholding your voice. It's about using it so wisely that you know exactly when it's no longer necessary.